right now with AI, we are living in a world where there are a lot of unknown unknowns. When we get to a place where there are more known unknowns that we can actually account for, predict, and plan for, that's when agentic commerce really take off.
Clear risk boundaries and liability frameworks are a must-have for financial institutions to truly trust this infrastructure. That infrastructure is the missing part at the moment. Glad you guys are building it.
What you've built with Vishwa is the perfect example of being able to cut off those errors early in the process.
Welcome to the number 5 series of our Hubble podcast. Glad to have both Evan Schnidman, head of Fidelity Lab, and David Dai, the CSO of Pharos, coming to the stage. Over the past year, we definitely seen AI move from generating quote-unquote intelligence to generating actions and even conducting the action. Starting from OpenAI, Anthropic, even recently, if you saw the update yesterday for like Visa, Stripe, all of those financial institutions, they joined the alliance and the formulate quote unquote OpenUSD, which is pretty much agent native as well, right? So everyone is start to think about agentic execution, specifically on financial rails instead of quote unquote assistance. So the entire framing of this series of podcasts is like beyond whether agent can reason. It's actually how we can safely let them conducting operation and move money. So before we dive into the entire detail, we would love to have both Evan and David introduce yourself, your background, and probably one-liner theme to this topic. Evan, if you want to start.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation. I've been operating in AI now for well over 15 years and have seen sort of the evolutionary arc of not only the growth of LLMs, but all of the broader applications and how that ties into the crypto and blockchain world. And so I think this is a really interesting synergy of those two areas, and just excited to talk about how agentic commerce really ties into the element of actually being able to automate away a lot of the legacy processes that our financial system was built on. And so, for me, my day-to-day is running Fidelity Labs, which is our in-house innovation incubation division. I'm building new businesses that have the potential to be the future of Fidelity or the potential to spin out and scale independently. And so we track new developments in the space very closely. And obviously that includes all things AI, all things digital assets, and just excited to have the conversation.
Thank you, Evan. David?
Yes, thank you, Nathan. So thank you for having me. I'm David. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Pharos. My day-to-day basically is to lead strategy and GTM for Pharos, think about where we're heading to from this chain's perspective and also from a stakeholder in this on-chain financial industry in general. We're trying to build basically a next generation of Alipay type of experiences by utilizing AI, agents, blockchain, and then just to be able to serve not only just the human beings, but also the agents in the future, the agent users. My background is coming from TradFi, spent last 10 plus years across banks and consulting, and then now particularly focusing on building this EVM compatible AI-focused L1, and then hoping to introducing some exciting products with you, Nathan, and then potentially with Evan as well.
Yeah, thank you both for introducing. And to start as a very broader concept, is right now, as we just introduced about the recent progress of the agentic workflow and agentic capability in the fintech space, right? How would financial services in general expose quote unquote capabilities to all of those autonomous agents without giving them the unrestricted authority? Because I mean, for compliance institutions and for, like TradFi especially, right? You don't want to give out your credentials, or you don't want to give out like all of those like PIIs or like customer information to the foundation model, which is already proven to be unsafe, right? So probably start from Evan. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think about this in a couple of different ways. So I actually started my career as an academic and turned my academic research into what became known as an alternative data company. And so the term alternative data didn't even exist when I launched that business, but that whole ecosystem has grown up. And I think a lot about where are we likely to see these types of transactions take root first. And I actually think data is the perfect example of what are the packets of information that can pass most efficiently that allow us to see autonomous action. And realistically, it's compliant organizations, compliant institutions trying to move packets of data that have to be secure, that have to be safe, that have, in many cases, will have regulatory barriers around them, particularly things like GDPR in Europe that have been in force for a long time now, But also you think about healthcare data and other confidential information. These are highly regulated pieces of information, but it's the exact type of information that's going to pass through these systems. And I've watched really the arc of what's happened in the data industry has been further and further modularization, right? So the ability to consume an individual data point was inconceivable 5, 10 years ago. But now, if you actually are able to do microtransactions, you might actually be able to see institutions purchasing on an individual data points or individual cells in a spreadsheet. And so the complication in all of that is security, right? What is the trust layer that is needed here? What is the information that needs to be confirmed for all parties to verify that they are in fact getting not only the right information, but that it's secure across all rails. And so when I think about this, I kind of just go back to the last 10, 15 years of watching the evolutionary arc of going from FTP to API now into the MCP world. And we're going to see these transaction volume massively accelerate. And that's going to require compliant institutions to have a whole additional trust layer that frankly hasn't existed to this point.
Yeah, I can totally get it because before you hop on, David and I were actually discussing our recent collaboration with Ondo. So essentially, they have a lot of compliance requirement using the MCP, right? Like knowing where your agent is, right? Those geo blockers, even like terms of use for popping out on the prompt, because those are very tricky when like other agent builders they haven't even thought about it, right? Because if you're purchasing a compliant like asset, right? If you're running a trading strategy over a compliant company, those are all of the edge cases that if you don't dive down, you will never know, right? So same question to David. What's your thought?
Yeah, definitely agree with what Evan and then Nathan you mentioned about, and I want to echo there's a lot of regulatory requirements around sensitive data. Evan mentioned about like HIPAA compliance for those healthcare data, those privacy requirements in the consumer financing, for example, which we're dealing a lot on the Pharos side. We would definitely not disclose those information to human beings, and that means that we will certainly not disclose those agents. I think we need a clear risk boundaries. And then we also need like liability frameworks because in some of for example, if this is a demo, then we know exactly how it was success. But in the real scenario or environment, there's full of surprise where maybe our model will get us like 99% accuracy. And then there's a one which represents like unrecoverable capital loss or maybe like regulatory breach. And those could bring a lot of issues, even though just like 1% of the chance. Now, if we expose those sensitive data to those models, not only might cause capital loss, but also get you in trouble with the regulatory requirements. So I think how to basically starting from know your agents, right? And then for each of the agents, make sure that they have the clear boundaries, make sure that they have a limitation or basically just fallbacks on their capabilities because they're capable of a lot of things. But the most important thing is that the agents is constrained and then know what can do and what cannot do. So I think in order to make it like AI native banking or AI native use cases, I think that is a must-have infrastructure.
I'd love to pick up on something you just said, David, because I think this is the liability component of this is something that has to be solved for us to see mass adoption too. I think a lot about the parallels between finance and healthcare because it's the only other industry that's really as heavily regulated, has the same privacy rules that we do in finance in some ways. And, it's been almost a decade now that radiologists have been outperformed by AI systems. And yet we don't see mass adoption of radiologic AI because somebody still has to sign off on that. There's somebody's malpractice insurance has to cover this. It's a liability issue. And so I think what we're seeing now evolve, especially as we've seen the acceleration of AI in the last couple of years, I think we're seeing an environment where the legal framework has to catch up for us to actually see commerce go the direction we all know that it will and it should. But the only way you're going to be able to have that limitation of liability, that the insurance policies that cover the costs on these things, is to have some way to verify that actually these systems are secure, that the data has been sufficiently modularized, that you aren't exposing things in irresponsible ways. And so there has to actually be the right infrastructure around that. Otherwise, from an institutional perspective, we can't adopt these systems until we know that there's sufficient trust and that there's a way to ensure that we're actually protecting people's information.
Yeah, 100%. I like that, particularly when you mentioned about insurance. I think it's a great for mitigation, but just the risk mitigation, I think is not the full picture. I think we also need a proactive like a preventions. And then I think the trust doesn't really come from the capability from the AI. I mean, they are already very smart and they will get smarter. But that doesn't just generate a lot of trust. I think the trust will come with the certainty or guaranteeing that if something goes south, or if AI simply just step out of the bonds, then there's a human being or there's a ways that basically just get it back on track. Just like your radiologist example, I think that's a great case. Of course, they can rely on AI to help them to diagnose, to generate the reports, that they'd be the last one to sign off. So I think that is also a key for institutional adoption of those AI agents to happen massively, which I think Vishwa is doing a great job that building that infrastructure.
Yeah, I appreciate the words. I mean, I can totally relate that because my college roommate did exactly the job that Evan has mentioned, because he did his undergrad research in UCSF doing like AI helping radiologists do those like MRIs and stuff. And at the end of the day, he turned around and did something else, right? So because, I mean, even if you do like a 99% of accuracy around on picking up those like ACL torn, like those kind of things, you still need a doctor to sign off to take the liability. And that is really hard to demo for, like for infrastructure builders, for like agent builders, because people don't know what they don't know. I will say they don't realize how important security is until they face a hack or until the loss of money, right? So the next question that would be very naturally applied for those AI builders, like what would be a great demo in this use case? Or as a customer, how do you tell an interesting AI demo apart from something that will be cool? Because we have seen videos, we have seen very cool demos saying that, hey, we can have this agent doing very, very cool stuff, but from the compliance and from liability, from security perspective, what would be a great demo that can actually be tangible and convincing for institutions and the policy builders? Evan, if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in. When I think about sort of a great demo, I start with a challenging premise, which is I learned a long time ago that when you have a technology-driven system of any kind, AI or otherwise, the standard for human beings to evaluate a technology system is, does it work 100% of the time, right? And the standard for a human to evaluate another human being is, are you better than a coin flip? And it's pretty much boils down to that, right? Human-driven systems, we're comfortable with the best portfolio managers in the world are right about 55% of the time. If I were to try to sell an autonomous trading system that's only right 55% of the time, the vast majority of institutions would laugh at me, right? And so the end result is we tolerate a much higher degree of error from people because we trust people's ability to recover from that error or size their mistakes, right? That's what every human trader will tell you, is they're very good at sizing their mistakes. And so when I think about this in the context of like, what do I look for in a demo? I actually try very hard not to look for perfection, because it's a standard that's impossible to hold humans to. So why are we trying to hold these systems to a standard that is unrealistic for us, right? So the question is not, is this perfect? The question is, how far from perfection is it, and will it scale? And that's a data question more than anything, right? What's powering the system? Do you actually have ownership rights over what is needed for this to scale beyond its current operations? Or are you going to continue to get a constant stream of data without essentially breaking the bank for your business? And so generally speaking, most AI systems live and breathe on high quality data, or at least large amounts of data. Knowing the distinction between, do you need volume or do you need quality? That's the first question I ask when I look at an AI system is, can this survive on just a lot of garbage data? Some systems can. In asset management and financial services, most systems need high quality data as well. And so then you start to think about the dependencies of, is this system actually scalable, or is it going to be either cost prohibitive, or are we going to run into a point where there's so much liability associated with the errors that you essentially can't institutionalize it? So that's kind of an amorphous answer, but I can probably point to a bunch more examples, but I'm sure, David, you probably have a bunch.
Yeah, I share the same view. I view infrastructure has to be a trustworthy layer. So if we're talking about demo or in some type of task environment, we know exactly how it would success because we have the finite possibilities, and then it's in an isolated environment, and then we probably already calculated all the possible failed factors. But in a real scenario, again, I think there's always full of exceptions. So I think what sets apart like the demo and then infrastructure is how the infrastructure actually handles the fails safely or handles exceptions, or when there's something that apparently is not going right, and then there is a system infrastructure reject that transaction or that trade or the activity before any capital is exposed or any compliance is breached. So long story short, I think it's not trained just for how to be success, but it's what to react when exception happens. And then that has to have some type of certainty, which will yield the trust for that infrastructure. at the end of the day, it's going back to the 99 versus 1 numbers, right? So 1% is still too high. I think what the infrastructure needs to be is be able to handle that 1% carefully and ideally minimize that number.
I was just going to say, I love the idea that being able to identify it early and cut off the error. I think when David, as you were talking, the first thought in my head is, I think, Nathan, what you've built with Vishwa is like, I think that's the perfect example of being able to cut off.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to tell.
Early in the
Yes.
process. Sorry, I felt I did your plug for you. There you go.
Yeah, thanks for the pitch. Yeah, because essentially we share the same proprietary view because this is how engineering design works, right? Let's say one specific incident happened. There are a bunch of warnings, right, in the front that you could have prevented from. So that's where, not just for like computer science or for financial system like engineering design, but also for in real production, where you're producing a car, right, where you're generating electricity. You have a lot of components that you can reduce the risk from happening. And the total percentage of the risk happening is like the multiplication of all of those reductions. So let's say every single firewall that you have set up has 90% of the coverage, right? If you set up like 6 to 7 different ones, the entire error rate goes down all the way to 10 to the negative 6, which is kind of negligible in that scenario. So I totally share the idea of both of you guys on how a high quality demo instead of like preventive, like the perspective instead of just showing, okay, we're building a cool product. And that actually naturally draws to the next question. Let's say people are saying, okay, our product is ready, right? So what does that even mean? Like precision is one of them, like risk prevention, we talked about it. What else should we cover in terms of even making the claim that our product is ready to use for like financial institutions? David?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think Evan mentioned about the term cutoff. It's actually a really good term because that's exactly what we need here. Because when we think about the trust, right? So it can live in different layers. It can live in model. It can live in like human beings. In hospital, it would be that radiologist, for example. In the bank, it would be mid office where we're monitoring those AI and monitoring those results. But they all have their disadvantages. For example, the model, right? So it's all about possibility. And then there's always limitations and there's always exceptions that fall out that probability and then that will create issues. And if we're heavily relying on human beings monitoring the AI, it will be really hard to scale. And then it also kills efficiencies. So it might actually help on the better results, but at the same time, it will also slow us down. So it also support the fundamental benefits that we're trying to create with the AI. So I think the trust should come with the separate execution infrastructure or infrastructure layer. So that goes back to that cutoff term. So if there is something goes wrong with the model, the human beings will catch that. If there's anything happens during that scale up, then there is a clear way to stop that execution. So I think that is a must-have. Not just say in the near future, I think it's must-have for any agent use cases right now that everybody's building.
Well, and I just love that David brought up the human in the loop. Like that's ultimately when we think about how do you contract AI in this era, ultimately, like the answer right now is still explain to me where you have human controls so that we know essentially how to step in, when to step in, what the protocols are. Because AI is fantastic in thousands of ways and deeply flawed in thousands of ways, right?
Yes.
And so we're now in this situation of we still need human-based systems to have a protocol, have a process where a human being is there and knowing when a product or when some new technology is ready for prime time, right? That's ultimately right now. What's the process for having a human?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that because I just had the conversation with some of the other AI builders on a concept of quote unquote multi-agent system. Because there are some debate over is human itself become the, like the quote unquote orchestrator of all of your agent, or you should let agent talk to yourself. In a perfect world, you have everything automated by agent. Agent can talk to each other in a very fluent way without the loss of information, but actually it is not, right? Basically, from that perspective, there are more than 50% of the failure rate. That's where like human has to stay there and become that center of the orchestrator. Just similar to the concept that we mentioned previously about like quote unquote supervised learning, right? That this is like very old school concept of machine learning back in probably when Evan, you were doing your PhD, right? So that was...
I appreciate you referring to that as old school. Thank you. Now I feel old.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole concept, right? Because no matter how big the bubble is, the underlying principles still holds, like how to get the scalability of the product, how to preserve a high level principle of engineering design, how to make sure that the product is intact, how to preserve the privacy, how to protect the data. The principles are always the same, right? No matter how fancy the actual experiment is, the physical laws hold. So that transformed to the very next question, that in terms of specifically, where do you guys see actually how far the adoption is from quote unquote financial copilot giving out suggestion to the actual operator? Evan, if you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, because you called me old a moment ago, I guess I'll start with a history lesson here. So, I mean, look, AI is not new, right? Like it's been around since the 1950s. Little known fact, there's been autonomous vehicles since the 1970s. They didn't move very fast. Turns out compute power was pretty limited back then. So like a leaf blew in front of a car and it would stop for 3 days to calculate, was that like a leaf or a child? Don't want to run over a child, right? What's changed dramatically, yes, we have a much more sophisticated view of transformers. We have a much more sophisticated view of how we architect these systems. But what's changed dramatically is compute, right? It's the ability to store data and compute extremely quickly. And so when I think about where are we in that historical arc, yeah, I love the reference to supervised models, right? Having built a bunch of supervised, unsupervised models. So you supervise initially on learning and then unsupervised continuous learning. And what we used to refer to as online learning models, where they continue to update. That was novel, not more than a decade ago. I mean, it was an extremely novel concept in 2013, 14, 15, and really, even into 2016, 17, you didn't see a lot of change on that. What's changed is that Transformers paper that came out of Google in 2018, and it took years and a chatbot for people to actually have uptake on that. But where we see that going is not yet a place where humans aren't in the loop, right? When I talk to large organizations, yeah, everybody is rethinking how their teams are structured, because maybe instead of having a 10-person squad, maybe you have a 3 or 4-person team with a product person, a few engineers, and a whole bunch of agents, but you're not eliminating the people. And that's the interesting component of this. And I think to a conversation I had a few weeks ago, where probably the smartest comment I've ever heard about AI was, what is the uniquely human trait that we bring to the table in this era? It's the ability to ask great questions. AI is phenomenally good at answering questions. It's extraordinarily bad at asking questions. And so where's the human in the loop? The human is asking the questions. The human is identifying the errors. The human is still critical to how these systems are being deployed, until and unless AI systems get very good at asking questions.
That really echoes the one of the skills that I recently used. It's just called grow me. So it explicitly said, okay, interview the user relentlessly about a plan or a design until reaching shared understanding, right? Just in that skill, interview me relentlessly about every aspect of this plan until we reach a shared understanding. If a question can be answered by exploring the code base or exploring the code base instead, right? And for each of the questions, providing your recommended answer. That's how I construct that skill, just like grow me, right? Asking the right question from both academia and the industry standpoint.
And a prompt is just a question. I mean, functionally,
Yes.
that's actually what you're doing, right? It's just a sophisticated, nested set of questions.
Yes, that's very true. David, your thought on this?
Yeah, I mean, if you guys remember, there's a theory a couple of years ago talking about above the algorithm or below the algorithm. I think that still applies. Basically is, so we take whatever the AI tell us and then put that into action. And then we basically work for our agents or AI, or do we actually ask the right questions? And AI will be able to do and execute right now for all the things that we do. So I think know what to ask and ask good questions is still something that human beings are better at AI. Maybe in some day they'll start asking great questions that we never thought about. But at this moment, I think that is the value we can bring into this entire equation. We're not trying to get rid of the human middleware, right? There's still the liability, the control that still exists at this moment. But in the future, how we interact with AI is that we ask the right question, they will give us the perfect execution with the proper controls and the liability boundaries, and then the clear pathway of recovering costs. Because I'm definitely not hoping this happen, but I'm expecting to see is a lot of loss of capitals and fails from massive adoption of the agent's execution without the proper execution, without the proper limitation and the boundaries. So I think it's unavoidable. There's so many people are trying and then obsessed with the AI capabilities today, and we all see how capable they are. but we haven't really seen like the damage they can do just yet. So this is actually the perfect timing for us to think about the controls, think about the liability, think about the risk framework. And at the end of the day, I believe that the risk infrastructure is much needed for the agents.
Well, I mean, this is not like a quote unquote assumption, right? Because we are part of the Anthropic cyber verification program. So we are able to use their latest model to run like the red team and the penetration test, black box, red box, and all of those. We have figured that there are a lot of vulnerable smart contracts, like explicitly sitting on chain and holding money. And sure, we are on the right side of the table, so we don't do it. But we expect that there will be people exploring that thing and just get it exploited. So that definitely is a actual problem that is, it could happen like probably 2 minutes after, right? So the next like immediate question will be, what would be the minimal things that every financial system should verify before they move any capital?
I think there's a million things they need to verify, right? If at the end of the day, if they can only verify one thing, I would say it's authentic of that agent. There's a great possibility that the agent that performing that transaction is not the agent that you're hoping to do the transaction. But again, I think there's too many things to be monitored. Even just the know your agent is not sufficient because even the authentic agent still might bring damage if there's no cutoff or boundaries to be clearly set. And then there's like infrastructures that monitoring for how it handles potential exceptions that is not currently being calculated.
I love that answer, David. As soon as Nathan asked the question, I was reminded of a conversation I had with our head of architecture at Fidelity last year. And it was really, what is the most impactful thing we can do from a security standpoint? It's identity. We can make sure to verify identity. And that's true whether it's a human identity or it's agentic identity. And that from a security standpoint, from an authentication standpoint, if we can solve for identity, that's the vast majority of the security concerns that we have is, are we actually sending money or receiving money from who we think we are, right? And that's not to say it solves all the problems. I mean, Nathan, you highlighted some of the vulnerabilities that have been exposed by some of the latest AI models, and those go well beyond just identity verification. There are folks who can infiltrate in between. But assuming your systems are otherwise buttoned up, identity is the most impactful thing you can do.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you can ensure the consistency between the user's intent and the execution, you actually get the minimal coverage of, let's say the system breaks, right? Let's say there are malicious transactions. You know who to find. You know who is actually controlling the agent. You know who is actually contributing to that agent. So you at least bare minimum, you have someone to hold accountable. Because we've already seen cases where people sue OpenAI for like giving a wrong suggestion, but they are not held accountable because they're not the company or the entity who is actually conducting the operation. They are just providing the tools, right? You can build a knife, you can build a hammer, but you are not the person to use the hammer to actually kill people, right? So that's definitely the bare minimum. I mean, sure, it's kind of like my comfort zone because that's exactly what our product is built on top of. But definitely the consistency between what you have authorized, like as someone who can be held accountable, authorize your agent to do, and your original intent should be satisfied, or at least should be consistent to what the endpoint of those settlement infrastructure or the execution venue, what they have conducted. Because the major gap that we have seen is that they just directly take whatever agent decision and they perform it, right? I don't blame them because people don't know what they don't know. Because just like David talked about, we kind of hope that there is kind of like an incident that happened so that people realize, of course, we don't want that thing to happen, but people have to realize how security is important. But from a builder's perspective or from the product perspective, we want to prevent that thing from happening. So definitely, I agree with both of you saying that the bare minimal, definitely the control of identity or control of the consistency will be mission critical in that front. And that actually lead to the next part of the discussion where like before any specific like implementation or if like agent can already prove that a transaction matches their signed intent before any fund can be moved, right? Like how much does that change the trust model for like agent operating like infrastructure or agent operating a financial system? Evan, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, that verification component changes the dynamics dramatically. right? It's not dissimilar in the TradFi world. Like you think about how we verify wire transfers. There's a reason why most large financial institutions still have voice verification on large wires, right? There's a lot of conversation about whether or not that actually is secure now, given the ability to spoof somebody's unique voice patterns. So
Yes.
we can set that aside at the moment, but there's a reason why that exists. It's because you have to have a protocol by which you verify account information, destination, et cetera, right? So when you talk about having that verification layer, that's a huge, huge leg up. And the ability to do that autonomously or quasi-autonomously, also from an efficiency standpoint, from a security standpoint, actually is probably more secure than what we're currently doing in the TradFi world, because it can be. And if you think about the underlying infrastructure, our systems were designed in an era in which people were physically going to a bank teller. And so if you reinvent the system from the ground up, you can actually have that verification layer be autonomous, as you know so well, Nathan.
David, if you want to.
Absolutely. So basically, I've been thinking from a specific use cases perspective. As Evan mentioned, there's voice callback type of thing, which in my past careers, I've been doing a lot of those. Even right now, everybody has been sending to the different wallet. We still send a small amount, like for task transaction, or break down the amount into the multiple tranches. In some extreme cases, we actually bring them down to very small pieces just to try to avoid the situation like that. And then even there's an agent who can perform X402, for example, but we still try to intentionally keep the amount relatively low. So there's still a very traditional process that has been performed, which I think is waited to be replaced by the infrastructure. So I think this is kind of like a missing layers right now in all those agents, execution, verification. It's almost kind of like if we're comparing to our TradFi, how we typically do the transactions or other things in our traditional world. It's basically there's no checks at all. And can you imagine that the consequences and then like what the liabilities would cost without any human checks? So I think it's the same concept.
Yeah, that's unbounded, right? Liability.
Yeah.
Because essentially to address that problem, I think, Evan, we mentioned about the ERC 8150, the standard that we were building from our previous conversation. I think that partially addresses the problem because that's definitely posting an immutable track record as well as the execution path, like before it gets settled. So definitely that cover like a part of the problem. And from my own perspective, there's another part of the problem that probably is proprietary for different builders, because that actually echoes back to our conversation like way earlier about the data ownership and the proprietary data. Because I made the metaphor previously to people that people don't like disclose their alpha, right? Their alpha is proprietary, but they need the guardrail for their beta, which beta, like in the larger concept, their OPSEC, right? Their general principle of operating the capital, their general principle in doing like the trading, including those very fundamental or basic information that you mentioned about, like even the recipients, right? Like the total amount, right? Those are seemingly primitive because banks and existing systems, they work pretty well on that, but they just don't have it for AI agents because it just moves so fast, right? So that actually leads to the next part of the discussion. As agent become more action oriented, do financial product need those like agent native interfaces? Because for instance, Robinhood, they could give out their MCP service, right? Like our collaboration with Ondo have trying to squeeze into the agent trading space, like all of those, right? So I'm just curious, both of your thoughts over this entire agent native interface or like an entirely new control plane, for instance, verification plane, or how the UX will change from that perspective.
I think that, we're going to be moving in that direction eventually. I hesitate to say that what's been done thus far is actually the right move, which is to say, I think there's been a lot that's been exposed that is seeing what the market will bear, right? Seeing what agentic commerce really looks like. And right now, we're not seeing the security standards meet what large institutional finance would actually deem appropriate. And so I think we will get there, but I don't think we're quite there yet, is my read. But David, maybe you have a different opinion.
I definitely echo, and as you mentioned, we're definitely not there yet. Just thinking from how agents interact with each other, they don't need human interfaces, like they don't need GUIs, they don't need to do that. So we're particularly focusing on like a consumer type of experiences. So we actually count, for example, like how many screens, how many buttons they click, and what's the timing between they click each button. For example, if we're thinking about the e-commerce platform, right? So we will even add some ads in between, just a way of capitalization, but that doesn't work for agents. I think there's different type of experiences that are entirely different interactions and then the experiences that needs to be developed. And that it's not necessarily based on GUI. But what that's supposed to be, that is something I'm not 100% because there's several ways that people has been doing it. There's people just simply thinking about the just multi-agents collaboration model. That's one. Maybe there is a governing agents to handling all the messagings between all of them. That's a different way. But that same question comes in is who will be the one that guardrail all those exceptions or even like bad actors in those agents because it's possible. So how do we design that experiences and how do we have the proper controls within those experiences? That is something I don't have a good answer, but I'm very eager to learn more about.
Yeah, I mean, because I do have some proprietary like experience on that one. For our user experience, it's good for people who move really fast that they are able to code their own agent. They are already in this business plane that agent operation is kind of like their daily thing, right? For instance, what we call the smart monies. That's where our first tractions are coming from. Also, those treasury manager who are afraid of their delta neutral strategy going to be replaced or like being running faster than those or outperformed by those smart money. Those are definitely relatively faster movers. But when we're actually selling security solution or like single control solution to traditional business, we have to package in a way that they're able to understand in their own language or in the language that they are familiar with. So basically, what our sales pitch to them, instead of being saying agent need a bank, right? No, they don't understand that. What they understand is that I don't know how to build an agent. If your entire solution are able to solve these specific problems, like for instance, for FS tests, are you able to help me do the load balancing, do the order matching because they have been connected to multiple vendors, right? They really need human beings operating at 24/7 across all of those small checks and the small orders that they have to match on both sides, right? Is that something agents are able to do? They don't even know. But after seeing the entire solution package, that's something that they are able to understand. So my 2 cents on this is that, yes, we are very, very early in terms of the quote unquote massive adoption because most of the people still use like AI as a chatbot, right? Instead of really doing the operation. But in terms of reaching there, like the sales pitch have to be, not like redirected, but have to be put our feet into their shoe to solve their real problem instead of saying, okay, we built a cool agent. They don't even know what an agent is, right?
And I think
that's my
you touched on something that is kind of near and dear to my heart, which is, the historical sort of paradigm by which we make decisions as human beings is not based on what is the factual information. It's what's the story we can tell. What's the language we can use, right? And this goes all the way up to, I mean, there's a great field in anthropology and sociology studying how decisions get made at central banks. And largely it's based on what they can explain, right? If you can't explain it, the market won't move in the way you need it to. So it doesn't matter what policy you make. So I think, the interesting quirk about agents is they don't need to explain things to each other. We need them to explain things to us as humans, right? But, David, you alluded to this before, like agents don't need a UI, right? And so the question becomes, when are agents communicating exclusively with agents? Because that changes the way, frankly, the entire internet functions, not just the way we interface with AI.
Exactly. David, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I just want to again echo what Evan said. I think agents doesn't really have that kind of like emotions there or some type of, well, I mean, they do, but it's not in the way that we have to consider, if this thing makes sense to other human beings. We have to consider like what's their knowledge level, what's their emotion. Agents doesn't necessarily care about those. So this is good and bad, right? Good is very, very effective, very productive, but at the same time, it could be ruthless. So I think also echo to you, Nathan, you mentioned we're in the very early stage of the mass adoption. I think that's exactly where we are. So from mass adoption to like AI native scenarios, like AI native banking, for example, I think it would happen when everything's shifted from like a Gen AI type of like conversational like novelty to risk managed, right? And then to some compliant execution engines that can reliably protect our balance sheet. If I'm thinking from bank's perspective. So it's all about liability. It's all about a known path to solve unknown failures and then a known path of recovery or to be able to identify and then liabilities and there's a known path to mitigate. So I think those are not necessarily all technologies. I think there's some type of human factors needs to be factored in. But hopefully, I don't think this is too far from us. Hopefully, maybe in the next year or few years, but it will happen fast.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely share the same expectation for this entire industry to move because like AI always moves faster than we expected, right? So definitely in the coming years or even in the coming month, there might be some revolutionary change that we haven't even foreseen. So as we approach the end of the podcast, I want to go back to the question that we asked at the very beginning to open this entire conversation, right? What has to be true before AI native banking or agent native banking becomes a trusted infrastructure? I mean, after we have unpacked the entire discussion for the past 45 minutes, is there anything changed from your original thoughts or what has been reinforced throughout the process? I mean, we definitely talked about the compliance, we talked about the liability, the data security, and what needs to be controlled for sure. But definitely would love to have one sentence summary from both of you on that perspective. Evan, if you want to start.
Yeah, I'll actually pick up on David's last point because I think it's critical here. Right now, we are living in a world where with AI, there are a lot of unknown unknowns. And when we get to a place where there are more known unknowns that we can actually account for, predict, and plan for, that's when we are going to see this type of agentic commerce really take off. It's not that we won't have unknowns. We have to have known unknowns.
That's a great point. David, if you want to.
Yeah, first of all, I really like that phrase. And I think that the unknown is really the key issue here. And then to your question, Nathan, I think nothing changed on my side. It just reinforced what I believed. I think clear risk boundaries and liability frameworks, those are a must have for like financial institutions to truly trust this infrastructure, trust this AI native banking. I think we just need to move from managing the model uncertainties to kind of like enforcing those risk boundaries and then the settlement at the fundamental layer, at the ledger level, not on the model level, not on the applications level. It has to be on the fundamental level. So I think that's the missing part. That infrastructure is the missing part at the moment. Glad you guys are building it.
Thanks. So, I mean, of course, we stand on the same side of the table. We, as a team, like not just for me, myself, but also my entire team, we definitely believe in. I really like the phrase that Evan mentioned about like the unknown unknowns, right? Because there are a lot of things that AI has been generated or has surprised us, like from the very beginning. Because one of my PhD cohort, he was actually the author of GPT-4o and GPT-01. So it was surprising to me that from what I understood as like machine learning or the neural net, all the way goes toward as you increase the context window, as you increase the capability of reasoning. This is how much that AI can do that go completely beyond my understanding. So as we keep up about our own knowledge about like what AI can do and what needs to be guarded, that's the known unknown, right? Those are something that we say, okay, here's what they can complete. Here's what we need to catch up, right? But those unknown unknowns, again, I really like the phrase. That is like what is critical from, like we have to be cautious. And meanwhile, we have to be innovative and preventive from the best knowledge that we have, given all of the updates and the input that in the market, like in the past incidences and our past experience in this industry. Yeah, so thank you both. Really appreciate it for joining the conversation and really appreciate the support for both me, program, and the team. A great conversation and hope to talk to you guys in real lives very soon.
Thank you, Nathan. Pleasure.
Thank you so much.